When you're doing a chaturanga or a yoga push-up with your elbows tight in towards your ribs, does it matter where you place your hands? A lot of teachers are going to obsess over every detail about where you put your hands. You've got to stack your elbows over your wrists. No, you've got to have your shoulders over your wrists. Does it matter? Well, we're going to take a little bit of a look at physics and see how the forces are going to change and either make your shoulder work really hard or maybe make your elbow work really hard in your chaturanga, your yoga push-up, in today's episode. So let's get to it. Hey, real quick, make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, share this video with your friends if they like anatomy too, and be sure to stick around to the end of the video where I'll give you a little movement experiment so you can feel this stuff in your own body. All right, let's check this out. So we've got an anatomy quiz here that I posted on my Instagram where you should be following me if you're not already. And I just want you to pause the video real quick and try to answer this question. So the question is, in Chaturanga, which is a yoga push-up, your elbows typically are going to be kind of by your sides rather than being way out, to your sides. Okay, so elbows kind of by the sides. Which elbow, shoulder, wrist alignment is hardest for the shoulder joint? Now, I'll point out, again, pause the video if you need time to think, but I'll point out that really the thing that's changing here is where they put their hands. So from position A to position C, you've got your hands are in totally different places. So your hands are really back far or your hands are further forward. And that's going to make or break the difference here. That's going to change everything, as we'll see in a moment when we talk about physics. So what's going on here is that the common cues are essentially either you're stacking, quote unquote. Yoga teachers like to talk about stacking joints. So let's see if that actually matters. Well, in pose A, you've got your wrists here and your elbow is stacked directly above your wrist. In pose C, we see that the hands are further forward so that the shoulders are stacked directly over your wrist. And the question here is, well, does one of these poses make it really hard for your shoulder? Hard doesn't mean bad. It just means, does one of these poses make it so that your shoulder musculature, that includes your anterior deltoids and your pecs and some other muscles, does that mean that your shoulder muscles have to work really hard? Well, if this idea of stacking joints is true, then you might guess that if you stack your shoulder over your wrist, then you would do less work. Is that true? It turns out, interestingly, that this is one of those common things that yoga teachers cue that is true, and there's some physics behind it. So what happens is all of our weight is distributed, throughout our body, but we talk about it as though there's a center of mass. So essentially, the weight of your body is being pulled by gravity towards the floor. And in order to not smack our face down on the floor, we have to push back. We have to push our hands into the ground. So we have to push into the ground, and that's going to provide resistance to prevent ourselves from smacking our faces on the ground. And that means that there is a line of force. So I'm going to erase some of this stuff, and we're going to zoom in on the first image here. So there's a line of force. Basically, force, we're trying to exert an upward force through our hands, and the shoulder is not at all in line with that force. And because there is a distance between the shoulder and that line of force, what happens is there's something called a moment arm. A moment arm is simply the distance between the joint that we're talking about, in this case, the shoulder joint, and the line of force. So that distance is going to determine how hard the shoulder joint has to work to overcome that force. You can think of a moment arm like a wrench. So if this is a wrench, and we have a wrench here, and it's trying to pull on the shoulder joint, the bigger the handle of the wrench, the more force gets put through the shoulder joint. It's called torque. So it creates more torque on the shoulder joint. And that means that in order to overcome that force of gravity that gets turned into torque at the shoulder joint, we need to resist it with muscular effort. So we've got to be nice and strong in our shoulders and our pecs and all those muscles, and we need to overcome it. So gravity is trying to take our joint and rotate it. I'll draw it in another color. Gravity is trying to push our joint so that our shoulder rotates this way. And we need to use muscular effort to try to push our shoulder that way. Cool? So the moment arm, again, is just this distance right here. Let's get rid of that. So what we see is that when the line of force has a great distance to the shoulder has to work really hard to overcome it. However, in pose C, we would see the opposite case. So the hands are pushing into the ground, so we're pushing into the ground in order to propel our body upwards. And when we are pushing in that line of force, we would see that the shoulder, there's no distance between our shoulder and that line of force. This does not mean that the shoulder is doing zero work, because there's a bunch of other forces that are acting on our shoulder, like our center of mass is pulling down, and there's a distance here, and that's a moment arm. But that's a little confusing for most people, so I just want to acknowledge that for those of you listening who know a lot more about physics. Yes, there's a center of mass. Yes, there's a moment arm here, and yes, that means that there's a force that's pushing down and creating torque at the shoulder. So we're going to ignore that, though. Try to keep things simple. If we're just talking about this resistance from the ground in pink, then we don't really have a moment arm of the shoulder. We have a huge moment arm to the elbow joint, which means the elbow joint, again, just like so here's a wrench and here's the handle. And if the handle is really long, then that force of gravity essentially is able to torque the elbow joint, meaning it can exert a rotational force at the elbow joint. Simple translation, the longer that arm, the more your elbow joint in this case has to do a lot of work. So your triceps, which are wrapping around the back of your arm, have to do a lot of work. Okay? So let's zoom out here and let's look at the three of these together. Again, let's look at the line of force exerted by the ground that we're trying to overcome. So we've got a force going up, we've got a force going up here, and then in the middle pose, it's basically just splitting the difference. So let's just look at the shoulder moment arms. So the shoulder joint is really far away from that line of force in the top pose. It has a little distance in the second pose, and it's right on top of it in the third pose. The elbow joint is on the top pose, is right on top of the line of force. In the second pose, there's a little bit of a distance. And then in the third pose, there's a really big distance. So that means that in the first pose, the elbow is doing the least amount of work out of the three poses. The second pose, the elbow is starting to do a little bit more work. And then in the third pose, the elbow is sharing more of the force than the shoulder. The opposite is true for the shoulder. So in the first pose, because there's a really big moment arm right here, right? That is a moment arm. It's really big. And that means that in the first pose, the shoulder is doing a lot of work. It gets smaller in pose 2, which means the shoulder is doing less of the shared work. And in pose 3, it's right on top of that line of force. So it's doing overall the least amount of work of the three poses. So why does this matter? Well, this matters for a few reasons. first of all, also I want to point out, if I wasn't clear before, I know I already said this, but in Chaturanga, your elbows are kind of to your side. So we're not talking about a bench press where your elbows are kind of like out. We're talking about Chaturanga where your elbows are in towards your sides. So the only thing that's changing is your hand position. And here's why it matters. So you can try this on your own. So try your Chaturanga push-up, and you might want to put your knees down to the floor to make it easier for you. And try to take your hands. Let's try the first pose. So get your knees on the floor, take your hands and slide them back so that they're sort of in the middle of your, at the lower rib cage area. And then try to do a little Chaturanga push-up from there. And you'll probably notice that your shoulder does most of the work. You should probably feel that your shoulder is working really hard. Versus if you, let's try the opposite here. Let's try pose 3. And take your hands so they're directly underneath your shoulder joints and do the same thing. Just keep your knees down if you have your knees down and do a little push-up. So as you lower, your shoulder remains directly over your wrist. And then you should feel that the back of your arms here and your elbow joint feels like it's working really hard. That's the main reason this is important. So it doesn't mean that either of these poses is good or bad. What it means is that the first pose is more work for the shoulder, and the last pose is more work for the elbow, right? So if you want to strengthen your shoulders, if that's what you're trying to work on, then the first pose is going to be more useful for you. If you want to work on your elbow more, then the third pose is going to be more useful for you. Another reason this matters is because if you have an injury that you're trying to avoid irritating that area, if it just doesn't feel good, it kind of hurts to do a push-up in a certain way. Let's say you have a shoulder thing and your shoulders just hurt when you're doing push-ups, but you really want to keep doing push-ups. Then maybe a good option for you is to take this third pose and slide your hands up a little bit, and then your triceps will do more of the work. Your shoulder just doesn't have to do as much work. Again, eventually you could return to the first pose. It's perfectly fine, but maybe pose 3 gives you a little temporary window of still being able to do push-ups without really irritating your shoulder so much. That's fine. So you can use this information however you will. Now let's look at a more complicated diagram, and I'm putting this at the end because it is kind of complicated. And if you stuck around this long, then maybe you're actually willing to look at, you know, some of those things and take this to another degree of complication, of complexity. Okay, so let's look at that. So I recently posted on my Instagram after that quiz, I posted this diagram, and I said that you'd be able to understand this. I promised you'd be able to understand this diagram. And I'm going to try to explain it to you a little bit, but I was doing some research leading up to this video, and there's a lot of complicated physics involved in a push-up, and a lot of it is way beyond my understanding. So I'm actually going to take the next couple of months and start, studying physics and biomechanics specifically as it relates to moment arms and levers. So I have a lot to learn, and I just want to be clear about that. So if you know a lot more about physics than I do, and you want to comment and you want to share resources, then I'd encourage you to do that. Or if I've said something that you believe I need to revisit or correct in my understanding, please share that. But here's the simplistic understanding that I do have at this point, and I think this is a useful way of looking at it. We have two main forces that are going on here and acting on our joints. The first we already discussed, and that's the force of our hand on the ground, and there's this force moving up. We already discussed how the moment arms, therefore, are a certain distance from the joint, here, right? And that's going to determine that the bigger the moment arm, the more work that joint has to do and the surrounding musculature. Well, there's another force acting on the joints, and that is that your center of mass, pictured in blue, is right here, pressing down. So we've got this downward force. It's a downward force from our body weight. And the way that you would look at that is that, again, here's your line of force. So let's just look at the top option here. And the distance between the line of force, so here's your line of force, and the distance between that line of force and the joint is going to determine how much work that joint is doing. So here's the distance to the shoulder. Here's the distance to the elbow. So of the total amount of weight, let's look at the full picture first. So in all three poses, I want you to notice that the distance to the shoulder is exactly the same. We can't change it, so we don't really need to think about it. However, the distance between the center of gravity, line of force, and the elbow does change. And what you see is that, here we go, the line of force at the bottom position with your elbows going further forward is a bigger moment arm. And what that means is that in the last pose here, your elbows are going to share more of the total force than your shoulders. Well, relative to your shoulders, of the three options pictured here. So the further your elbows get away from your center of mass, the more work they're doing. Okay? Because the shoulders aren't changing, so the only thing that's changing is the elbows. But if you look at that, you have the same story that I painted originally when you look at the force from the ground into your hands. And that is that the first pose has the shortest distance, the shortest moment arm for the elbow, and that the elbow does the least amount of work. And then the last pose has the biggest moment arm for the elbow, and the elbow is doing more work than it did in the first pose. So I hope that that shows you, again, we've got a downward force from our center of mass, and then we're resisting it by pushing our hands into the ground. That creates sort of a upward trajectory. And so those are two forces. But the truth is that there's all these other forces too that are acting on our joints. There are tiny little moment arms where our muscles connect to our bones. All of our muscles, in all the places they plug into our bones. So all of those areas have forces that technically, if you really wanted to look at, which joint is doing the most work, you'd have to calculate all those. And I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. I don't have the expertise in physics to accomplish that task. But in my current understanding, I'm fairly confident that the way we looked at it originally, which is to say that just pretend like you're doing an upside down push-up and that you're just pushing into the ground. And then if the force is coming from your wrist, whichever bone or joint, I should say, is stacked directly over your wrist, that joint's going to do a little bit less of the work. And whichever joint is further away, that joint is going to do more of the work. So in this example, when your shoulder is far away from your base of support in your hands, it's going to do a lot of work. But if your elbow is far away from your base of support through your hands, your elbow is going to do a lot of work. It's a simple way of thinking of it. And I hope this can help you to modify to either achieve your strength goals of trying to make an area of your body work harder, or help you to work around little aches and pains as they come up and say like, I'd rather put a little less work into my shoulder today because it's bugging me. Great. If that helps you keep moving, awesome. Then here's a way that you can use biomechanics to stay active and help your students stay active. So the biggest takeaway is none of these poses are bad. None of these poses are just like bad for your shoulder or bad for your elbow. They just put the forces into those joints a little differently. And so in some cases, you might choose to use that to your advantage or disadvantage, depending on your goals. I hope this helps. If you have questions, please comment. If you have any suggestions on the physics of this, because I'm not a physicist by any means, I'm actively studying it because I need to learn more about this subject. If you have suggestions on my understanding or things that you think I got wrong, please comment. I will revise my understanding and update, make a different video to try and give a proper understanding of this concept. Thank you for watching. Share the video, like it, subscribe, do all the things, and I'll see you in the next episode.